now. All right, well, welcome everybody. Just make sure that that worked. Yes, it did. We are live. Welcome to COVID-19 Impacts on Lake Organizations. I'm Mike Engleson. I'm the Executive Director of Wisconsin Lakes. And with me is Eric Olson, UW Extension Lakes Program Director, and my producer and co-host for this webinar. Hi, Eric.
Hello.
I don't know if you want to go through the housekeeping stuff, how to ask questions and stuff for those that are just joining us.
Sure, real quick, there's actually a couple of different options, but one of them is preferred. You should have a Q&A feature, a menu item that you can see. And if you click on the Q&A, you can just type in a question. If it's a short and easy question, then I can answer it on the fly. If it's something more complex, then we're gonna probably save it until later in the talk, and all those questions will stay in the list. I believe that you also then have a feature actually to give a question a thumbs up. So if someone already typed in a question that's similar to what you wanted to ask, just repeat the question by hitting the thumbs up button, and that'll move questions higher up in the list. We also do have a chat feature, so some folks have already started using that. It's fine to use the chat, but it does create a whole nother thing for us to monitor. So we would prefer if questions are directed to the Q&A panel. We're going to go through a presentation, and then after that, we will have time for fielding those questions. And then if there is time kind of later on, we will ask people to raise their hand, and then from that, we might be able to unmute people if they have a question that they feel they need to articulate out loud. There's a question Mary asked already about Clean Well, Clean Waters. And
I'll be getting into that.
Yeah, we'll talk a bit about specific programs, and we're going to talk about general things that maybe you need to keep in mind as well. So, yes.
All right, so I'll go ahead and get started on the presentation, and I'll close the poll right now and share results just so that we can see who is here. Most of you were able to respond to that. So it looks like we've got a pretty even split between lake associations and lake districts. And the good majority of people are worried about the ability of their organization to hold meetings. So that's probably the lion's share of what I'll be talking about in my talk. And hopefully by clicking out of that, that got rid of that from the screen. So for the agenda for my talk, I'm going to go over meetings, basically how do we do them. We'll talk a little bit about fundraising and holding events, or if we can hold events. I'll go into some very quick updates on program and activities like Clean Boats, Clean Waters, and other things like that, and then share some resources with you, and then hopefully there will be some time at the end to answer some questions. So before I get into meetings in general, just a quick overview of where we're at in the state right now. I did check like 10 minutes ago whether or not the Supreme Court had come back with any kind of decision on whether or not the extension of the Safer at Home emergency order that was done in emergency order number 28, as you see on the screen, if that had been overturned by the Supreme Court, but did not see that there had been a decision yet. So as far as I know, the order is still in effect until May 26th. And I think most of you are probably familiar with it. It's, basically the idea is to prevent essential travel and have some impact on what businesses could be open. It does allow for essential government functions to continue, and I bring that up because that might be an important point when we get to talking about lakes districts. what that says in the order is that all services needed, it includes all services needed to ensure the continuing operation of the government body. So we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into districts. And then the reopening plan that Governor Evers has announced is called Badger Bounce Back. That's a phased reopening, and it's based on a number of different metrics, including rates of infection, of symptoms, of hospitalization, and ability of the state to meet certain benchmarks on testing, tracking, and tracing infections. Phase 1 means social distancing will still be in place, and meetings of 10 or less will be allowed. We're not there yet, but that would be the first step in the bounce back plan. Phase 2 would still include social distancing, but would allow meetings of 50 or less, which begins to make it a little bit easier for organizations to meet. And then once we finally get to phase 3, which we're quite a ways away from, no social distancing required and basically unlimited gatherings. There would still be some other things required, but I think at that point, probably lake organizations would be able to hold meetings if they wanted to, as they normally would. So let's talk shortly about just some general ideas about how to do meetings in this difficult time. This first bullet point is one that we're going to come back to on nearly every slide we talk about meetings. Know what's essential, ask yourself, and as an organization, ask, can you put it off until later? Because the easiest thing, the best way to do things is to meet in person and meet in the way that you're used to meeting. That's not to say that going virtual on a meeting is bad or even difficult. If it's something that you've been doing, Wisconsin Lakes, our board of directors has been meeting for the last couple of years. At least one meeting has been entirely virtual, and it works just fine. So if it's something that you're used to, it's going to be a lot easier for you than it would be if you're having to create this system completely newly, and then there are certain restrictions that may prevent you from doing it in some cases if you're a district. But if you are deciding to go virtual for the first time, one point I would make is try to test your systems to know what you're able to do and what you're comfortable do. If you're going to use Zoom, get your Zoom account and run some practice meetings, because as you could even see in the lead up to going live on this, we were kind of playing around with some things and checking them out. Let the people that are going to be attending the meeting know what to expect ahead of time. So even if you're not required to put out a notice, you're going to let people know that there's a meeting somehow. Tell them that it's going to be virtual, and if you have decided on how voting is going to happen and things like that, let them know. Once you get into the meeting, know who's leading it. That's a very important thing with virtual meetings, is when you're not in the same room, you can't be, it's even on video, it's hard to be looking at each other. So if everyone that's there knows who is the leader, that's going to work out the best for you. And have a good rock solid agenda so you know what you're trying to accomplish, and that leader can lead you through that agenda. Like we're doing here, we're using the question and answer or the chat function to ask questions. It's a good idea to use those sort of systems if you have a lot of people. We have 100, upwards of 100 people on this webinar at the moment, and it would be very difficult if everyone was asking questions over the top of each other. So if you're in a very small meeting, 10 people or less, you might be able to have all the mics open, but otherwise using this hand raise function is a good idea. And then again, know what your voting process is going to be going into the meeting. If you know that there are votes on really anything, decide ahead of time if you're going to do a poll, a roll call vote. Basically, if you're using Zoom, you might be able to use the raise hands function if you don't need more detail on that or something like that. So that's all important things to think about just in general about meetings. So now I'll start out with lake associations, because quite frankly, lake associations are a lot easier to handle in this time than lake districts are. You'll see that because I only have one slide on lake association meetings and I have several on lake districts. Lake associations, as you know, are nonprofit corporations. They're governed by usually by Chapter 181. The vast majority of lake associations are incorporated, and they do so as a non-stock corporation under Chapter 181 in most cases. And Chapter 181 specifically allows virtual meetings unless the organization specifically prohibits them in their bylaws. So if your bylaws don't say anything about you can't hold an electronic meeting, then it's really up to the governing body of the association to decide whether or not they want to go ahead and do that. Lake associations also have the advantage of not being subject to Wisconsin open meetings law. It's possible that there might be one or two of you out there that for some reason would be, but that is a big rarity. You would have to have some sort of governmental function as part of what you do. And so if you are a nonprofit organization, you're not subject to Wisconsin open meetings law in virtually all cases. There are still some best practices to think of and to take into account. Be transparent, all of the things that I talked about on the last slide. But this second one, know that your participants' technological capabilities and plan accordingly, I think is important. This goes for any virtual meeting, quite frankly. If you know that half of you are going to be on the phone rather than viewing things on the video screen, then it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have major decisions that need to be made because you've looked at something in a presentation. If you know that people can't use Zoom and you have to use something else, then how you take votes may be different because not all of these web conferencing systems allow for a hand raise function or something like that. So know the system and know what the people that are going to be using it are able to do and plan accordingly. And then this is obvious, identify yourself before you speak. If your mic is open, and don't speak over everyone else. That's really, this slide and the one before it are really mostly all I have to say about lake association meetings, because you do have all of this power to make decisions. I have had a question from a couple of groups that they have, even in their bylaws, a specific date, second Saturday in June, that their annual membership meeting has to be held. Does the board have the ability to move that? I actually think they do under this sort of situation, because the board is granted pretty broad powers in order to, as far as running the organization. And so in this case, because there are these orders that prevent you from being able to meet in person, then you probably, you can feel fairly secure in being able to decide, no, we have to postpone this and move it to another time. If you're really concerned about having something on the 2nd of June, but you want to move it off and still have an in-person meeting, you might be able to just hold a virtual meeting for the sole purpose of voting to postpone until you can meet in person. But again, really, pretty much anything that you come up with as a lake association, you probably will is probably going to be okay. And if you have specific questions, we can get into them later, or you can talk to me offline. So now I'll go into the thicker thicket, lake districts. So lake districts are not nonprofit organizations, or at least not nonprofit corporations like lake associations are. They're actually governments. They're special purpose units of government, excuse me, which are governed by Chapter 33 of the Wisconsin statutes. And lake districts have a couple of kinds of meetings, just like associations. They have Board of Commissioner meetings, same as the Board of Directors meetings. And then they have a statutorily required annual meeting for all members of the district. And there can be special meetings of the members as well. So we'll start out with the district commissioners meetings. And my first recommendation for district commissioners meetings, these need to be quarterly, by the way, at least quarterly. But if possible, delay them until an in-person meeting can happen. because of the health orders that are in place, I believe that it would be appropriate if there was a really good reason, and quite possibly the difficulty of holding a virtual meeting might be that reason, that it would be okay to delay a quarterly meeting until an in-person meeting could happen. So I do think that's a possibility for you as a district. But commissioners' meetings, in terms of the number of people that are at them that make decisions, 5 to 7 people, make a virtual meeting fairly reasonable to make decisions on. And there actually are lots of governmental boards and committees across the state that are holding virtual meetings, even up at the state level. So a virtual meeting is certainly permissible under the Wisconsin open meetings law. Because it's a lake district, you must follow Wisconsin open meetings law, and the Department of Justice Office of Open Government has issued guidance that says that government meetings can be held virtually and still meet the open meeting law. And I'll have the link to this down here at the bottom of this slide. The DOJ Office of Open Government, this link will give you a page with a whole bunch of information just on open meetings, but it also contains a bunch of information specifically related to COVID-19. And the bullets on this slide actually come almost directly from that page. So this is what Department of Justice has indicated is necessary to meet open meetings in a virtual setting. So to be in a virtual open meeting, it can be either video and or teleconference. So you can have a video meeting that also has the ability and really should have the ability to call into it necessary, or you could just have a pure teleconference meeting as well. But the key piece of this is that the meeting must be reasonably accessible to the public. And I'll get into that on the next slide. You do still need to follow notice requirements for open meetings, and that notice should include information about the remote access. If the meeting is using an internet-based video service like Zoom, you should also include an ability for people to phone in and listen in that way. Most of these web platforms actually already allow for that. And let me give you an example of what a meeting would look like. To that. So this is a notice from a Wisconsin Elections Commission meeting. You can see that it indicates that it's a teleconference only meeting. Down here, it talks about how the number that you call and how you get in, what's going to happen. All participants' phones will be muted. I think in this case, there might have been another number that the actual commissioners were able to call in. That's not absolutely necessary. You could do it all from one Zoom thing. And we'll get into this closed session piece in a little bit as well. The last two bullets, I won't read those. They are important though, because they also were mentioned on the DOJ site as important pieces of qualifying as an open meeting. The recording the meeting is not a mandatory, but if it's possible, it's a good idea to do so. Obviously, if you've gone into a closed session, that part doesn't get reported. So let's talk about the idea of what constitutes as reasonably accessible. I think Wisconsin Lakes has actually given some people some advice, and I've seen this given elsewhere, that you still need a centralized location. DOJ has put out guidance that has said that's actually not the case, that you can still qualify as an open meeting if you do not have a centralized location. And by that I mean in the notice of a physical place where at least one person attending the meeting is going to be. So it's as if the meeting is somehow anchored to that one place. You may have seen the legislature held a session where they had a handful of legislators in the Capitol and everyone else was on a virtual session. That's kind of what we're talking about there. But that actually is not necessary. You do have to keep aware, however, that if some individuals don't have the ability to access the meeting by phone or by internet, you might need to make some accommodations. There's not a lot of guidance as to exactly what that means, and it's a lot of gray area. But I think especially if some folks came to you, contacted you before the meeting after it's been noticed and said, we don't have good phone or internet, but we want to be able to participate or at least listen in or watch, at that point, you probably are obligated to find some accommodations of how to do that. And I'm not sure what exactly that would be. I've talked to some people that, well, maybe you could set up a TV outside a government building in a parking lot that's streaming it, if you can get that technology to work, and then have people social distance in the parking lot. That might be a reasonable accommodation. Really, I think what the department is ending up getting at here is that every meeting is going to be different, and so you really have to look at these things on a case-by-case basis to determine if you're reasonably accessible. And that's not very definitive, and that doesn't necessarily make everyone feel all that comfortable about it, but that's the best that we have been able to get out of DOJ. You also have to remember that remote access may not be feasible in some instances. I talked before about making sure that you understand the technology that everybody has and kind of plan to that. Well, in terms of determining reasonable accessibility, if, for instance, there's a complex plan or drawing that needs to be considered and many of the participants are joining by phone, that may no longer satisfy reasonable accessibility for that meeting. So you may not be able to consider that complex plan in that way. And the last point on this is that what is reasonable access now under the current safer at home order may not be what's reasonable at other times. So after this is all over, what is reasonable access may be much more strict. It may even get stricter as we go through the Badger bounce back plan. And so my recommendation, I guess, is the more controversial or yeah, I think controversial is probably the right point, that if you think there's a reason that the things that are going to be decided upon at the meeting are challengeable, the more you want to try to get some advice directly from the Department of Justice on whether or not it's your idea of reasonable accessibility meets theirs. It's not incredibly easy, of course, to get a hold of them right now because everybody is asking them questions, but they do have a phone number that you can call and leave a message basically, and hopefully someone will get back to you. And I'm almost done with the section on lake districts, and we'll get to some questions. I'll take some questions on this when I get through this section before moving on. But I did want to take a second to talk about what we mean by a closed session. So bodies may go into a closed, have statutory reasons that they're allowed to go into closed sessions, even if they're subject to open meetings law. If it might be that they're discussing an employment matter or there's some sort of confidential thing going on. And closed sessions are still allowable under a virtual meeting, but there really is no guidance from the department as to exactly how to handle them that I have been able to find. So again, if possible, I would say if it's a matter that has to be decided in closed session, if you can delay it until it can be done in person, do so. But if necessary, then you really need to make sure that non-participants can't hear or see what's going on. this fourth bullet, I've got the Sun Prairie Area School District policy on virtual meetings, and I've seen this same language in other school district guidance as well. School districts being a governmental body similar to what a lake district is. And so for those of you who are on the phone, it says that it requires meeting participants, in our example, district commissioners, to expressly affirm that the board member has taken appropriate precautions to safeguard the privacy and integrity of the closed session, including but not limited to precautions that would reasonably ensure the closed session is not being recorded without the board's permission, and that no non-authorized person can hear or access the discussions or other confidential information. So essentially, the commissioners would be just swearing to the fact that they have done everything they can to make sure that the session is in fact closed. I'm going to go back to this, the Elections Commission notice, and you can see here they say the Elections Commission will convene in open session but may move to closed session under the statute. This meeting is not noticed for the commission to return to open session. So what they've done is they've put the closed session at the end so that after line item C, they'll say, all right, we're going to go into closed session. They'll get all of the public out of the meeting, and then they'll talk, and there's no need to go back into open session because they've said that's not what they're going to do, and when the closed session adjourns, the rest of the meeting automatically adjourns. That's probably a pretty good way to do it if you have to. Best, however, to figure out how you might handle a closed session in a virtual meeting, and set that policy in an open session so it's transparent how all of that was decided. That's district commissioner meetings.
Mike, can I interject?
Yeah,
Just with
sure,
some
go ahead.
questions that might allow us to clear some things up.
Sure.
One of the questions is just phrased this way: can the board of a lake association conduct business via email? And I guess the reason I wanted to bring that up too is to again contrast how a lake association might be able to operate with how a lake district must operate.
Correct. So a lake district would not want to do it by email, but a lake association can. I'm not aware of any limitations on how or what can be decided in that manner. I would suggest that there be some sort of decision and possibly an amendment to bylaws before that happens, if possible. But there's nothing in the statutes that I'm aware of that prevents it. And in fact, Wisconsin Lakes has used that. It's especially useful if there's a specific vote that needs to happen. So one way to do that is to have the chair send an email to the board that declares the meeting open. If there's a decision that needs to be made, there's a resolution that's introduced by a response to that opening the meeting email. There's a second, so you're conducting it just like you would a normal board of directors meeting. And then there needs to be some method to collect votes. So that could just be email responses that there are then printed or digitally saved somehow so that there's a record of what the vote is. I've actually done it where I've created a Google form that allows the directors to vote that way, and include the link in the email. And then all of that, it's a good practice to save it digitally. But yeah, there's a fair amount of stuff that can get done by email, and that would be completely legitimate as long as it's a decision that it's in the purview of the board of directors and doesn't have to go out to the membership. Though there's nothing that I guess really would prevent an email decision by members, but if you have a 100-member association, that's a lot of emails to keep track of.
And then, we can contrast that to a lake district where you really cannot be conducting business by email because you would be violating the open meetings laws. The open meetings laws in Wisconsin are really meant to ensure transparency and visibility of your actions and decisions. And so by doing it by email, you would not be able to say you were transparent. So just want to put that out there. And then Someone said our district had a conference call in April. Would it be appropriate to post the recording onto a private Facebook page for a lake district? What's your take on that, Mike?
That's a good question. Even though the page is, so with any kind of meeting, I think with open meetings, I don't believe that there would be any reason that that recording would have to be made easily accessible to the public, because obviously if you had an in-person meeting and it was not recorded, there's no requirement to record it. So I should preface this by saying I don't know the answer for sure, and if you really want a good answer, probably need to go to Department of Justice. But I would think that would be okay. That would just be like keeping minutes in a file cabinet or something. If, because it's a record that you have, however, if a member of the public came to ask for it, you probably would have to disclose it, under, say, a Freedom of Information Act request or something like that. But yeah, because with a private Facebook group, anybody, as long as you're making anybody in the district eligible to access that meeting as well, I think that would be fine. Though if there was confidential, if it was included a closed session with confidential information, then it would be appropriate, I would expect, to just to limit it to the Board of Commissioners or whoever was part of that meeting.
Yeah, and I would just again reiterate that with local units of government, whether it's a school district or a lake district, transparency helps reduce the chances that people will develop conspiracy theories or their own ideas of how things are operating. And so my recommendation would be simply to make it publicly available, to post it on the Lake District page. If anyone wants to listen to it, they can. Another question here about delaying meetings. So the question is specifically about a lake association and your recommendation that they push back the meeting. It says they have bylaws that state that the Lake Association annual meeting would be the second week in June. Is it worth it to keep delaying when we don't really know when we could meet in person again?
That's actually a really good point, and I'll get into that a little bit in this session on Lake District annual meetings. There is a question of when you'll actually be able to meet. So certainly, I guess my recommendation would be, if you don't need to do something now and can wait, then you might as well wait. But there will be a point where you have to make the decision, okay, we can't wait any longer, or there's too many important things that are going on that have to be decided, so we need to go ahead and do it. And then if you're able to do it virtually and make those accommodations, then that's fine. And as a lake association, you're not subject to open meetings law, so you don't have to do a lot of that stuff that I was just talking about. So you don't have those legal worries, I guess. You do if you have a large association where there are normally hundreds of people that show up. You're going to have to figure out, okay, how do I accommodate all of the discussion that usually happens with this? Do we have the Zoom or the Google Meets or the WebEx or whatever system you want to use, that sort of capability to the level that you need to have to make the decisions that you need to make? But if you can get around that, then yeah, I think if you're thinking it might be too much trouble to delay it, then maybe that's a good sign that you want to go ahead.
Yeah, and again, for a lake association, it's fairly, I don't want to say straightforward, but going the virtual route might make your life a lot easier rather than trying to somehow compose an in-person meeting. Becky Gaskill just posted some questions that were really comments about going into closed session. If you do that at the end of the meeting, you do need to somehow bring it back into open session by the end of the meeting, just so that you can not have to start the next meeting in closed session, I guess. So there might be a technicality there about how the closed session has to come to a conclusion so that you're back in open meetings.
Okay, that's a good point. So probably that Elections Commission, they came back into open session, but they didn't, they immediately
Adjourned.
adjourned, so there was no need to make a big deal about it, I guess.
Yep. Another quick question too. I think this one's pretty quick. Zoom meetings can be recorded. Can the posting of a recording satisfy the open meeting requirement for a lake district?
Not, so there has to be an ability to participate.
Yeah, I think you have to be able to listen to the meeting that's actually happening while it's happening, not after the fact.
Yeah, though, if there was, so like I've seen, it was one school board for the public participation piece, anybody that wanted to like a public comment period was not allowed, which is probably true in most commissioner situations. You could, not take public comments that weren't submitted before the meeting or something like that. So what this school district did was they said if you wanted to make a public comment, you had to submit via email, and then that public comment would be read into the record by the secretary. If that's done and then the meeting is, the recording is presented, that might qualify. I'm honestly not sure. That would be something that I would, before I did it, I would definitely check with the open meetings folks. If you're already doing something on Zoom though, why not open it up to let the public listen in as well? And there are ways with Zoom or the other systems too that you can kind of lock down who can do what even.
Quick question here. Lake districts have to have a minimum number of 4 commissioners meetings. If you postpone a commissioners meeting, wouldn't they have to have an open meeting and have an action to change that meeting? Or can the chair simply state that a commissioner meeting is postponed?
So that's tricky if you're bumping up against the end of the fiscal year, basically, or the calendar year. I don't know if you remember, Eric, if it says that they have to hold the 4 meetings within the fiscal year or the calendar year. Because if it's calendar, would be much easier. I think it says, isn't it a minimum of 4 per quarter?
I think it's four meetings within a year. I don't think it's very specific. And I think my answer to this has more to do with keeping your train on the tracks as far as preparing for the annual meeting. I typed in a response. So if you go into the answered things, you can see that there really is no such thing as a quarterly meeting cop or someone in the Attorney General's office who verifies that quarterly meetings do in fact take place of a lake district. It's really up to you to make sure that you get all the work done needed to carry off an annual meeting. And in general, that means having meetings roughly quarterly. However, as far as a specific date being set for a quarterly meeting or a Lake District board meeting, under these pandemic circumstances, I think you have a little more latitude to push those dates to when they work the best, and then making sure again that you're complying with the open meeting standards expected of a board meeting.
I think let's hold off the rest of the questions and move on so we can get through as much stuff. I know we had this scheduled for an hour. It's probably going to go longer, and I do want to get into the clean boats, clean waters stuff. That won't take as long once we get through the meetings. But I'll go through the Lake District annual and special meeting stuff, and then the rest of it, and then we can get back to questions at that point, maybe. So in addition to commissioners meetings, lake districts are required to hold an annual meeting, of course, and then they can also hold special membership meetings as well. Those can be declared by either announced by either the Board of Commissioners or by petition from a number of the members. And those could be held virtually. You still are required to follow open meetings laws, of course. The problem that we have run into is figuring out how to hold an annual meeting where you have commissioners' elections. And in fact, annual meetings, that's a statutory requirement of an annual meeting, is to hold a commissioner's election. And I'll get into that and maybe a way around it in a moment. Because of that electing commissioner statutory requirement of Chapter 33, not because of the open meetings law, it's really difficult, we believe, to hold an annual meeting virtually. For one thing, you have to ensure that you are only allowing eligible property owners and electors to vote, not only on commissioners, but on any matter. It's a little bit easier probably to vote virtually on the budget than it would be on the commissioners, because the commissioner vote has to be done by secret ballot. And a new law that I'm going to talk about next that deals with a procedure for counting votes and actually allows for a recount has now made it, in my opinion, virtually impossible to vote virtually. So this law was passed and signed by the governor in February. It went through the legislature as Senate Bill 335 AB 360 for the policy wonks on the call. And what it says is that, first of all, in terms of voting in commissioner elections, the ballot must be distributed to qualified electors and property owners who are in attendance at the meeting. That is in addition to a prohibition elsewhere in Chapter 33 that does not allow for proxy or absentee voting at annual meetings. So you have to be in attendance in order to vote. And so one hurdle for a virtual meeting is figuring out how you certify that you have only qualified electors and property owners voting. Problem number two is that the ballots then must be counted and the results reported at the meeting. So keep in mind, this is not just a COVID-19 related bill. This is how Lake districts now have to conduct their commissioners' elections. Ballots have to be counted and results reported at that particular meeting. So if you're meeting virtually, there has to be some way that the ballots gets counted. But to make it even more difficult in a virtual setting, the candidates or a designee of the candidate have to be allowed to view the counting. So you have to have a problem. You have a problem with meeting the secret ballot requirement, first of all, and then you have to have some way that when the secretary counts those secret ballots, other people can watch them be counted. And that is a almost impossible hurdle to get over. But then you have this recount allowance that has now been put in place. And I should back up and say that this bill occurred because of, specifically because of a district that had a very contested election where there was a lot of controversy over the election of the commissioners and the way that the vote count happened. It was brought to a legislator because there's this level at which Lake District Commissioner elections are part of the regular election laws of the state, you know, from governor on down to local officials. The feeling was that, well, if we're doing it that way, there needs to be some sort of ability for people to declare and ask for a recount. So after a number of different iterations, this is what ended up passing. So any elector or candidate can request a recount. Notably, the statute doesn't say that a property owner who is not an elector, so an elector is somebody that is registered to vote in that particular location. Property owners are also allowed to vote in Lake District elections, but by statute, they're apparently not able to ask for a recount. I think that was probably a drafting error. I pointed out those drafting errors before the bill went to a vote, but that particular one ended up not getting corrected. And so right now, at least, property owners can't participate in a recount. That's kind of an aside to what we're talking about here. If there's a recount request, it has to be noted in the minutes by the secretary. So what's the process for the recount? If it's less than 100 votes have been cast in the election, it's pretty simple. The secretary just recounts the ballots until there are 2 consecutive counts that come out the same. I think it actually has to be 2 separate recount counts. So the first time the secretary does the count and it comes out 80 to 10, someone asks for a recount. The next time the secretary counts, it comes out 80 to 10. Secretary has to do one more recount that comes out 80 to 10 for the vote to be official. It's more complicated, however, if there have been more than 100 votes cast. In that case, after a single recount by the secretary, it's over, unless the losing candidate requests an additional recount. If that happens, secretary records it in the minutes. The ballots have to be placed in a container sealed with a tamper-evident seal. Those ballots are then delivered unopened to the clerk of the most populous municipality in the district, so it's usually a town in most cases, within 2 days of the election, and then that clerk has 2 weeks to conduct a recount. The candidates have to be given 48 hours of notice of the time and place of the recount so that they are able to uh, um, view the counting, I guess. And then once the counting has been done, the results are transmitted to the district secretary. The clerks actually are able to charge the district for time on that. No recount can be requested once the meeting is adjourned. So if you go through the secretary counting, no one says anything, the meeting's over, and then a recount can't be requested at that point. If you are a district commissioner and didn't know about this, your head may be exploding at the moment, but this is the law that we're under, and the pressures of being in the stay-at-home order make this all the more complicated, and I think you can probably see nearly impossible to accomplish in a virtual setting. You would, if the ballots are virtual, the ballots pretty much cannot be virtual because the strong implication of everything that the statute says is they have to be placed in a container that can be sealed. So there has to be some physical thing that is the ballot. So there may be a way to get around that. I haven't heard, and I've heard ideas of maybe could we do drive-by voting before the meeting starts, but then is the voting has to occur within the meeting. The people have to be present, so they have to have, somehow the meeting has to have been convened already. It gets very, very complicated and would be very difficult. So then the question is, what do you do? You've got to have an annual meeting, right? But you can't hold it virtually, but you can't have the meeting in person either. So we've come up with at Wisconsin Lakes, so Eric has participated in these discussions, and one of my directors, Dan Butkus from the Squash Lake District near Rhinelander, helped hash some of these ideas out. These are the 2 options we've come up with. These have not been put past an attorney. I do have a law degree, but I'm not licensed to practice law, and I do spend a lot of time thinking about this, but this is not a legal opinion, and so if a district was to go ahead and use one of these, it wouldn't necessarily be a horrible idea to have an attorney take a look at it and decide if it was the right thing to do or not. But the options we came up with were, first, if for some reason you need to hold your annual meeting and can't really push it off until later in the summer, or it gets, well, we'll get into that in a second. If you have to push it off until later in the summer, then you could call a special meeting. So the Board of Commissioners would hold a virtual meeting to vote to call a special meeting, and then the current budget can be amended at a special meeting, and so you could just either extend the expenditures in that current budget out as far as you need to go. If there are specific things that need to be authorized, you could authorize those, or you could probably just come up with a whole nother set of revenue and expense lines and vote on those at the special meeting, which can be conducted virtually. That's still not simple, but it's certainly possible to do because you don't have the secret ballot problem of electing commissioners. And then you hold the annual meeting in person at a later date, and that's when you elect the commissioners. My opinion is that even if there are commissioner terms that technically end, at when the annual meeting usually is, if your annual meeting has been pushed out, those commissioner terms extend as well. You could, if you felt like it was important at that special meeting, vote to extend existing commissioner terms until the annual meeting is being able to be held as well. So that's option one, special meeting that takes care of what needs to be taken care of, and then an annual meeting is held later. Option two, maybe a little more dicey, you actually hold the annual meeting virtually, but instead of electing commissioners, you pass a resolution postponing the commissioner elections to a special meeting that probably would be called after the shutdown is lifted. The potential problem with that is that Chapter 33 requires a commissioner election during the annual meeting. So you're technically violating Chapter 33 if you don't. My feeling is that because of the restrictions on gatherings and the problem of holding a commissioner election virtually, that's enough of a reason that you have to come up with some sort of reasonable solution. And the fact that there is a state of emergency in place probably would give you the authority to do so as not only as a board of commissioners, but if you're holding the annual meeting and voting as a district to postpone the commissioner elections, then the people, the voters of the district have made that decision. I think that would probably be deemed okay. If for some reason it was really controversial to someone and they challenged and it went to court, the biggest issue that I could see that the logical response of the court would be to order you to hold a commissioner election, which would then either have to be at a time when you were going to do it anyway, or the court would give you the cover to say, okay, well then we have to hold this in-person meeting, even though we technically can't under this order, whether we want to or not. We've been ordered to by the court, so we have to. So at that point, you would be able to elect the commissioners. So the option two is a little more dicey. It's got some things that, especially if you're going to go that way, that might be a point where you want to talk to an attorney before you do it if you have counsel. But that was our second option, so that if you really feel you need to hold the annual meeting to pass a new budget for the next 12 months, pass a resolution to just postpone the commissioner elections. So that's all I have on Lake District. So maybe, Eric, we could take 5 minutes to take any questions, and then I'll get into the other stuff, and then we'll have a little time for more questions at the end.
Sure. Sorry, I hope you couldn't hear me typing there. One kind of broad overarching question about lake districts is just whether or not it's fair to go into Chapter 33 to address some of these things. Like, is there a legislative fix? And what are your thoughts on that, Mike?
So yes, I think we are learning a ton about some issues with Chapter 33. There were a lot of things that we already knew and had issues with that we've been talking about as a partnership for a few years and had planned on trying to go to some legislators in the next session and maybe get some fixes. Obviously, there are some things that it would be nice if they could be fixed immediately. And so one thing I am working on is trying to work with some people to see if there's some way, if there's another legislative session that has some legislation that would be based on COVID-19 related issues, if we could work something in there, maybe an extension of the date that the annual meeting has to be held by, currently by statute, unless you decided to hold it at another time. At a previous annual meeting, it has to be between May 22nd and September 8th. So we might be able to get that extended. It really can't be extended that far because at some point you have to hold a meeting to vote on the budget so that you can get your tax levy off to the county. But I am talking to some people about trying to do that. Towns association or town boards have the ability to convene an annual meeting and then immediately recess it and extend it a certain number of days. And they actually in the last that first package of COVID legislation were allowed to. They had an even shorter time frame to hold their annual meetings, and that got changed to say that it just has to be held within 60 days of the end of the stay-at-home order. So that's a possibility. Something like that could happen as well. I have to say, with this legislature and the way things are going, it's like really questionable what they're going to be willing to consider. So big wholesale changes probably are not going to happen this year. The consideration of fixes to the some of those voting issues and some other things are not going to happen in 2020. It'll be when the next legislature convenes after the first of the year, if it happens.
One question, Mike, about board elections is why we don't look more like a town board election in terms of process, with maybe early voting being an option. Why is it that the commissioner elections need to take place at the annual meeting?
That's a good conceptual question, and I'm not horribly familiar with how town boards vote their people onto their board. But the statute is what the statute is, and that's the law that we're under right now. So that's actually probably a decent model to look at when we're thinking about how we might change this to make this a little more useful and resilient in these sorts of times.
Currently, though, statute does allow people to be nominated at the annual meeting, doesn't it?
I think you're right, yeah.
I don't think you have to compose a ballot ahead of time. And a lot of districts do it, I think, fairly informally. Who wants to serve on a commission seat?
Yeah, there's this weird sort of lack of formality in districts, and this that conflicts with this very strict statutory. Like, there are places where the statutes are very strict, and because it's a kind of an ambiguous question of how truly tied to our election system are elections in districts. And so there's a lot of ambiguity that can be fixed there.
One person asked, can you hold the annual meeting to vote on the budget and then recess the annual meeting until a later date and not get into the issue of a special meeting? So can you somehow hit the pause button on an annual meeting and then reconvene the same annual meeting?
Yeah, so as Eric said, I'm interested in what Eric's answer to that would be as well. But as Eric said, districts, there's a lot of wiggle room on some things in Chapter 33. So there's no prohibition of that necessarily.
I think the main challenge there is that you do need to notice your annual meeting, and the notice requirements for the late district annual meeting and special meetings are pretty rigorous. And they include mailing the notice to every property owner in the district, as well as putting other notices out to address residents who may not be property owners. If you're going to try this one, again, sort of like do it at your own risk, but notice that second part of the annual meeting after the recess, you would have to probably notice that just as rigorously. You wouldn't be able to just have 20 people show up for that annual meeting and then recess it, and only those 20 people know when it's going to reconvene. I think you'd have to let everybody know.
Yeah, and the really strict reading of the statutes for towns are explicitly given that authority by statute to recess. And so if the legislature decided that for one governmental body that they had that power because they gave it to them, there's an implication that other governmental bodies don't have that power. I have no idea what the statutes say as far as county governments and other other even other local units of government. So that would be interesting to look at, but that's definitely something that I've thought of as would could be a useful addition to Chapter 33. The new law about announcing the winner of elections and counting them at a meeting and when recount can happen also kind of comes into play, because if the meeting goes into recess and goes for 2 months, I think you end up with some questions of what happens with those ballots. If the count was announced prior to the recess, does someone still 2 months later get to ask for a recount and all that kind of stuff too? All right, we can get back into meetings. I know we're at the hour mark and we still have some stuff to cover. So why don't I go into that so that those of you who were anticipating that you would be done by 5 maybe can get out of here by 5:15. And I don't know how long you're available, Eric, but I certainly can stay for a while longer.
Sure. Yeah, me too.
And the rest of this really won't take very long to get through and has nothing to do with meetings, so it'll be a nice diversion if nothing else. I wanted to talk just a little bit about events and fundraising and what to do if your organization, especially, and this probably mostly applies to lake associations, if you rely on an event for a big amount of fundraising for the year. Of all the things that I've put on the screen that are self-evident, I think that event planning is problematic at this time is one of the most self-evident things. Even if by for some reason we get to July or August and restrictions on gatherings have been relieved, will people come to a lake fair that you normally have planned for August 15th? Are people going to gather in the same way at the same levels, even if they can? And how does that impact your potential fundraising bottom line for an event? So that's something to consider, I think, when you're deciding whether to go ahead with a live event or plan to go ahead with a live event. And then keep in mind that the timing of the decision to go virtual there are a lot of things that can go into that. If you're having people travel from a long distance or speakers that are having to commit, if you have a facility that you're paying for to use that you can't get out of that lease if at a certain time, all of those sorts of things can lead to the decision of going virtual even when the rest of the state may actually be open at that point. So an example of that, the Northwest Wisconsin Lakes Conference is going to be a virtual event on June 19th, which was decided to go virtual on that weeks ago, mostly because we were hearing that many of the presenters were not going to want to attend. Heard from some of the people that would normally attend saying, it's probably not a great idea. And in terms of being able to get the planning done to make it virtual, the planners decided that we needed to make that decision, and we did. Even though who knows, by June 19th, depending on what the legislature does, maybe it could have been held in person. And again, would people have actually come to it if it was? So if it is a fundraising vehicle for you, what do you do? How do you fundraise virtually if you're used to fundraising as an event? The good thing about this is that virtual fundraising has been going on for decades. That's the way that many organizations do fundraising all the time. So virtual fundraising can be mailing a letter, sending out an email asking for donations, explaining the situation and saying, hey, we normally have, our lake event is our big fundraiser. We can't have it. Would you be willing to make a virtual donation? Phone calling is not always the most fun for the person asking for the money, but that is certainly a way that people do fundraise. there's lots of stuff that's already been done, and there's lots of ways that we know how to do it. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that at some point in the future if they had any questions about that sort of stuff. I think a really great example of this is here in Madison. There is a professional soccer club, Ford Madison FC, which the season is more or less toast, at least most of it at this point. And they've started they're obviously not a nonprofit organization, but they have some need to raise some money to keep the club open, and also saw it as a way to raise some money for charity. They've actually started selling tickets to a virtual game where you pay, I think they're $10 quote unquote seat. And half of that goes to a charity, and half of that goes to help keep the operations of the club going and people employed. And then they're going to do a big mural at the soccer stadium with all the names of all the people who attended it. And the sort of hook is that they're trying to break their attendance record by selling more tickets to this game than they've sold to any other. So it's the Ford Madison versus COVID-19 game. So there are lots of fun little hooks that you can try to help yourself do that. Another important thing to keep in mind is that any kind of communication with members at this point is important. If you're not going to be able to meet in person, if you want them to keep your association or keep the activities of the district in mind, all the more important to make sure that you're talking to them somehow. I'll point you to a Lakes and Rivers Convention session that I did with some folks from our LakeKit.net program on building an electronic communication strategy that is linked in to your website, to social media, to emails, and to print stuff as well. There's a link to the Lake Convention archives on the last slide, so you'll be able to find those there. I encourage you to go watch that might give you some ideas of how to build a strategy that just helps people keep in contact with your organization. And then the last point is that even though this is a time where everybody is asking for money and many people don't have it, and there are probably other things that you think to yourself, gosh, can I really be asking for money for this when, the food bank needs funds and things like that? That's all true, but I still don't think you can be afraid to ask. The way groups like ours exist, except in the case of lake districts who can do it through a property tax levy, but a lake association especially is by people that care about what it is that you do, and what you do is still important and relevant. And so don't be afraid as a board or as an organizing group to ask for that. So that's what I have to say about fundraising events. And I'll now go through just a quick set of updates on some programs and activities that you might have some interest on. I don't have a ton of information about each of these. I will try to answer questions, and Eric may know some things about them as well when we get through them. And basically, the message is going to be similar for each of them. Clean Boats, Clean Waters is, of course, the aquatic invasive species prevention and monitoring program that puts people on landings to talk to boaters. That program is suspended at the moment until June or until the orders are lifted. My understanding is that because you're not able to be out on the landing under a CBCW program, that accommodations will be made in regards to the requirements for grants. I'm not exactly sure what that will end up looking like or meaning. I think a lot of that depends on how long things go on. And then I know that the agency and the folks at Extension that run this are working on some guidance for opening the program as we move through those Badger bounce back steps that I talked about. I think a good question is whether this program especially should be declared essential, because landings are open and boaters are getting into the water and there's a distinct threat of AIS transmission. Some states have declared their landing monitors as an essential service and have gotten exempted from the stay-at-home kinds of orders. Also, because for the most part, Clean Boats, Clean Waters can probably be conducted fairly easily while still meeting social distancing requirements. So that is something that Wisconsin Lakes is beginning to discuss with the Department of Natural Resources and with the governor's office, and we'll be moving forward on that in the next week. Quite frankly, depending on what the Supreme Court decides and how things go with that and what the legislature does, we could be moving towards a more open situation more quickly, and then that might actually make it easier for the department to bring Clean Boats, Clean Waters back more quickly. We do know that there are associations, and in some cases, I think even some counties that have said we're going to do this regardless of whether it's under the Clean Boats, Clean Waters banner. And so we're from a Wisconsin Lake standpoint, we're aware of all that, and we are factoring that into our decision as we talk to the governor's office. And I can answer more questions on that in a moment. Citizen Lake Monitoring Network and the Water Action Volunteers, the stream monitors, again, everything's suspended until the orders are over. Monitors are being directed not to collect water chemistry samples because the labs, state labs, while open, are probably not able to process them. So the decision was just to don't bother collect any chemistry samples for the time being. I did want to point out that there are still webinars available on monitoring put on by Citizen Lake Monitoring Network. And if I'm not mistaken, you can access those and watch those back through UW Extension Lakes YouTube page, which if you happen to be watching this webinar on the Wisconsin Lakes YouTube page, we subscribe to it, so you should be able to find it there. Is that correct, Eric? Those are all available on your page?
The archived webinars are there, and then there'll be more live webinars starting next week and into the week after that. And we will likely pick those up again into June.
Super. Surface water grants, so lake protection, lake management, river grants. DNR is encouraging all of the grantees to follow emergency orders, of course, practice social distancing, and do things that state government is asking folks to do. However, they are telling people that if there are any activities under the grants that are able to occur, they probably will be able to be reimbursed under the grant agreement. So if it's something that you normally would get reimbursed for, the reimbursements will probably go through, but you might want to check with your DNR representative on your grant just to make sure. And if there are any significant deviations, there may be some sort of amendment required. In general, DNR and all of its staff understands what everyone's going through, and they're of course all going through it with you, trying to adjust to working at home and figuring out how to handle all of these things. They're trying to be as accommodating as possible. They are being as communicative as possible, but obviously working from home puts some limitations on what they're able to do, and their response time may not be as quick as they are in more normal times. And they may have been pulled into some other activities too under the COVID-19 state reactions. Other things that are going on, of course, probably everybody knows that boating, any ramps on state property are open at this point. Fishing is going on. State parks are open with annual stickers. You can check with your localities whether local or non-state ramps are open. I've heard varying things about decontamination stations that different places have typically set up for AIS. So whether or not bleach buckets and things like that are being allowed, there are probably, maybe ironically in the case of a bucket of bleach, some questions about problems with keeping those sanitized and how often things are getting changed out in terms of potentially passing on the virus and that kind of stuff. If you have a larger unit like a CD3 unit or something like that. I'm not exactly sure how those are being handled. So I'd be interested if people have stories, if they wanted to share them with me via email as to how things are going with that early on in the season. We'd be interested to know.
Mike, quick question. It says here, when someone asked, under a surface water grant, can the lake organization still have a consultant collecting water samples for analysis?
So my understanding, and Eric, if you've heard anything different, and again, I would check with DNR to make sure this is true, but my understanding is what they're basically telling people is if they're not making the decision whether things are happening as essential services and are therefore allowed. So if you do them, they um, they should be reimbursable. The one thing I'm not sure about is whether the samples will be analyzed by anyone. Eric, do you have a comment on
Yeah, I
that?
mean, from what I've heard, the state lab is receiving samples. It's not exactly their priority to process water quality samples when there's other lab activities going on, and they're trying to reduce, I think, the number of folks working at the lab who aren't directly related to processing public health information. So we're trying to ramp up the scale of testing for coronavirus, and I would hate to think that somehow water samples are competing for people's time in there. I know that's not a happy answer for people, but I think if, to the extent, again, if you're looking to get, say, a couple of samples in the summer, maybe we just postpone the sampling that you're trying to do right now, and know that you probably aren't going to get turnover data for 2020 in the spring, but it might just be better to try to delay that.
Just a couple more slides and then we can open things up for general questions. I did want to just talk a little bit about the travel advisories and restrictions that are out there. Safer at Home does prohibit unnecessary travel, but not all travel. And I think that is important to consider both as you are a traveler and why you might be traveling, and if you're at a location where people are traveling to, because this is, of course, a subject of a lot of debate and consternation on a lot of people, understandably so. So what Safer at Home does say is that travel to second homes or residences should be avoided if possible. So if there is I'm not sure what the possible reason necessarily is, but if there is a reason that travel has to happen, it's not completely under Safer at Home prohibited. An essential travel, which is allowed, does include travel related to the provision of or access to essential government functions, which way back at the beginning was showed was defined as basically being things that you need to do to keep your local government running. I haven't been able to get clarification as to whether or not a lake district is a local government. Sometimes in the statutes it is, and sometimes it is not. But assuming that it would be, if someone had to travel to do something essential, so say, help out with the getting a Clean Boats, Clean Waters program going, if those are declared essential, or some other thing that is determined to be essential, travel in that case probably would be appropriate or allowed, at least under Safer at Home. That said, there are many counties, especially in the north, that have enacted travel advisories, so it's not, they can't actually keep people from crossing the county line, but asking people stay away because we don't have the facilities and we don't have the healthcare capability to handle an outbreak. So please don't travel to where we are, even if you do have a second home. So I think a good recommendation is, think about whether you need to. Is it something that you can put off? Consider the impact of where you're going. If you got sick, people can can be asymptomatic and be getting sick and not realize it, so you can get to a place. What's going to happen if you do? Um, are you putting that location then under some threat? Would you be able to get back home? That's hard to say, but at the same time, if you're at a place and you see people from outside your area, remember they may have a legitimate reason for being there. And this is not a black and white decision by any stretch of the imagination. And what I have been encouraging people to do is to try to be as understanding as possible as we work through all of this. This is a list, and the slides will be available for download, probably not until tomorrow afternoon. I'll try to get to it tonight, but the slides will be available. I'll put the list of resources up on wisconsinlakes.org as well. But this is a list of just different resources that have information about COVID-19. So there's the Office of Open Government site. The Towns Association has some remote meeting recommendations that might be of interest. If you are an association or a district that has employees, Schultz Nonprofit Law is a law firm in Madison that deals specifically with nonprofit organizations, and they've done a really great job of providing some webinars on both on the small business administration loan programs where you can get funding to help pay for employees, and also just general unemployment questions and things like that. That's a great site to get some information from. You can see the DNR and Department of Health Services pages on COVID-19 updates. There's a link to the Lakes and Rivers Convention archives. In addition to the electronic communication program that I talked about before, there was a workshop on being a Lake District Commissioner, being a treasurer, I believe, and one on a more advanced commissioner training. And then, of course, Wisconsin Lakes has its own COVID-19 info as well. And that, finally, is all I have to say on all of that. It's 20 after the hour. I'm happy to go until at least 5:30. I don't know what your limitations are, Eric, but we can certainly.
I can stay till 5:30. Quick question again from the Q&A. Clean Boat Clean Waters can be considered essential just as water testing is an essential activity, or sorry, just as testing is an essential activity for the virus. They're trying to prevent the spread of bad stuff into the lakes. Mike, are you using that sort of logic, I guess, when you're talking to the governor's office or folks about getting Clean Boat Clean Waters to be deemed essential?
Yeah, that would be the primary argument. That was the basis that was used in New Hampshire as well, and it makes a lot of sense. I believe that enforcement under NR 40, which is the DNR rule regarding invasive species, has been deemed as essential. So not in every case is there going to be an immediate response, but it could be. So I think that, using that argument is another reason why Clean Boats, Clean Waters, which is not just monitoring or education, it actually is a prevention tool. And it's really a key one of the biggest ones that we have in the state. So assuming it would, our argument is not to open it, to just reopen it exactly as it always has been. There obviously would be social distancing requirements and some other things that would have to be worked through. There have been questions, are we handing out brochures and that kind of stuff? What about trainings? But I think there are probably ways that we can work through all of that and get people out on landings relatively quickly.
Yeah, and I was part of there was a meeting this morning, a Zoom meeting to talk about exactly what Mike is touching on. It's not as easy and straightforward as some people might want it to be, but some of these questions have to get addressed. So for example, should the people staffing a boat landing, should they wear a mask? We're kind of leaning towards yes, because they ought to demonstrate concern and they ought to demonstrate courtesy. And so part of that would be demonstrating that they care enough about the boaters, them coming and going, that they choose to wear a mask. We realize that mask is becoming sort of this weird political football, but it just seems as though it's going to be the polite thing to do. Just like similarly, they're going to be asked to keep that 6 foot distance from other people at the boat landing, and they're going to be probably not directly going on to somebody's, like touching the person's boat, but instead asking the boaters to address different plant issues or anything that might be not in the right place when they're trying to put their boat in. So we are working on the guidance and the training that would have to go out, and everybody's kind of operating under this compressed or sort of stressed time frame. Another question just kind of about going up north, like what happens if you're building your cabin, you've got the rules would indicate that construction is considered an essential business, and so construction companies are active, but can you go up and check on that construction if you don't live locally? What would your response to that be, Mike?
I think I honestly want to say that I'm not here to make decisions for people in those sorts of situations. That really is a personal decision that you have to make. And I think, keep in mind all the things that you keep in mind in terms of when you go to the grocery store and how those are multiplied when you're traveling longer distances. But I'm not going to say that there aren't times when it's certainly appropriate and necessary to be in a different place.
Yeah, and I think just last week we had some pretty wicked winds here in central Wisconsin, and if you've driven up I-39 between southern part of the state and up north, you realize there's this flat area just south of Point, and a dust storm blew up that caused a multi vehicle crash to happen on I-39. So imagine people are going 50 miles an hour, smashing into the vehicle in front of them. We in Stevens Point have to then bring people into the hospitals, and they may not want to go to hospitals, and we certainly don't know where they're coming from, but we're going to put them in our hospitals. Nobody got in their car that morning and said, boy, I'm planning on getting into a multi-car crash on my way to the cabin up north. But those types of things can happen. And so, like, to the extent that you could have your contractors video document what they're doing, send you photographs, or have somebody that up north go to the job site in your place and take photos and take video and send it your way. I think that's going to be a better way than just saying, I'm going to just hop, skip, and a jump up to the cabin to check on the footings that they put in. And I know that's hard to say, but it's like, here we are. It's a pandemic. It's not exactly situation normal. A real pertinent question, Mike, about weed harvesting and aquatic plant management. Do you have a sense of how the state is handling that? Are projects being permitted and going forward?
I don't know if I've had it. Was that question answered when we talked at the AAS partnership meeting when they talked about aquatic plant management? Eric, were you on that call?
Yeah, and I think they were leaning towards, like, it again, the DNR is not making determinations about whether a work project is essential
True.
or non-essential. They're punting that over to workforce development so that they can be consistent across, regardless of whether it was grant funded or not grant funded, or operating on a general permit or operating on a specific permit. I do know that locally the McDill district in Stevens Point is planning to go ahead, but I would say anybody who's going to be doing that, given a green light, ought to ensure that they've done everything they can to minimize risk to the workers themselves. So for example, in our neck of the woods, Golden Sands does work. They're a nonprofit group that goes out on lakes for monitoring purposes. They used to drive 2 people in a vehicle to every lake that they've gone to, and now they're asking their staff to take separate vehicles so that they don't spend that time together potentially communicating a virus from one person to the other. So think about the precautions you'd want to take before you greenlight activities like that.
I do think as a district, there's probably an argument that that's a core function of what you do as a governmental body. So there could be an argument that that's effectively an essential government function, because that's an important service that governmental body is conducting, and if it's like Eric says, if it's able to be done in a way that's safe, that might pass muster for that reason.
And then Rich just wants something on the website on handling elections and budget for districts. Basically, can we put this all in writing? And I think we're getting to that point. There's going to be some updates in lake tides that's going to be getting into your mailbox around the middle of the month. But both at Wisconsin Lakes and our webpage, we'll be posting information so that you're operating with the most recent and up-to-date information. It's challenging because everything's dynamic. Things are, if the governor decides to end the stay-at-home order early, then we're going to jump and react to that. If, on the other hand, a bunch of people get sick, especially like in rural areas, we're going to recalibrate based on that as well.
Eric, you've been the monitor of questions. Are we good? I think we're probably have time for maybe one more if there's another.
Again, like, do we have any general sense, Mike, about lake associations? Are they going to do virtual annual meetings, or are they delaying when it comes to associations? We don't really know, do we?
Anecdotally, what I've heard is kind of all over the board. Some have said, yeah, well, we're just going to go ahead with virtual meetings. I think for associations, it seems like because it's easier, I've probably heard more that we're thinking about just going ahead. Districts, I think, are still, I don't know of anybody that's made a firm decision yet.
Yeah. So I think part of what we're going to do is plan to do these again. Someone asked earlier about, will you do this before September? It's like, I kind of think we're going to end up doing something like this monthly. I do recommend that you sit through the introduction of Lake District Commissioner training video that was produced as part of the convention archives. So that was a Wednesday, April 1st workshop in the morning. A lot of questions about who can vote at an annual meeting. Those are generic questions that don't have much to do with COVID-19, and I hope people are being consistent with this. But I also might work with Mike and see if we can do just a basic Lake District Commissioner training. We did one last summer up in northwestern Wisconsin. I was planning to do an in-person workshop in southeastern Wisconsin this summer, but under these situations, it just makes sense to maybe just do something similar to this, just another online welcome to Lake Districts, and focus on some of the nuts and bolts, especially for people who are brand new to a commissioner position.
I think Eric and I are becoming such pros at doing Zoom things that we can whip them out. As long as the subject matter is there, we can whip out anything we need to. So yeah, we'll be, you can watch wisconsinlakes.org, subscribe to the Lake Connection online e-newsletter that used to be called the e-lake, watch their Facebook page and all those sorts of places to find out when things are announced. I think the UW Extension Lakes Google Calendar, which that's available to the public, correct?
Yep. So go to the UW Extension Lakes webpage, and we have a calendar. We'll be putting things on there. That's where you can also find where these webinars are coming up next week and the week after that.
Great.
We'll be posting webinars from all over the region too. If it's related to lakes and it's something that people want to learn about, we'll share it. Thank you. I see people are dropping off. That's great. We had over 110 people participate in this, so that's an indication to us that this is something that people want. So we'll continue to do these sorts of trainings.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Hopefully that was helpful. feel free to contact me and send me questions. I'll get to you as quickly as I can. I do get a lot of them, so my response time is a little bit slow as well, but I will try to get to everyone with to answer your questions as best as I can. So, and thank you to Eric for being my co-pilot through this.
You betcha. Mary says she wants a participant list, so we'll see what we can do from that too.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I'm able to get that, but we'll see what I can do. So, going to stop the recording. And for those of you watching on YouTube, thank you so much. We'll talk to you next time.